everybody who is attending this talk today. I appreciate you giving and sharing your time. Thank you very much to Ocean Adventures, to Martin, to Paul, to all of the support. I'm excited to be in this part of the province. We live in an incredible place. So I am here today to speak about the wolf cull, the provincial wolf cull. That's my main focus. I just start off with a bit of a, can we maybe dim the lights a little bit? People don't have to see me so well as I want them to be able to see the images. So Trish has kind of explained a little bit about wolf awareness, and I'll go into that in a little bit. I put this slide up. It says luposlipophobia, so wolves are Canis lupus, the fear of being pursued by timber wolves around a kitchen table while wearing socks on a newly waxed floor. Because a lot of what I do in my role is dispel myths. There's a lot of misinformation about wolves out there. They are kind of a hot topic, and some of the things that I'm going to be talking about today are moral and ethical issues. So we're going to have people on different sides of the table. I want you to know that even though I am a wolf supporter and a large carnivore supporter, by no means do I want to see caribou go extinct. I want balance in our province. And hopefully, you know, with the information that I'll present today, we will be able to understand a little bit more about what is actually happening. So, like I said, Trish really pretty much introduced us. I just rekindled this organization about 4 years ago. It was dormant. So we still do operate at a pretty grassroots capacity. That being said, I work with some fantastic biologists. I've got a very strong board of directors, you know, involved in the IUCN canid specialist group. And we choose the wolf because I've mentioned it's misunderstood, it's very highly persecuted, but also because of its very important role in maintaining biodiversity and the health of many other species and functions in ecosystems, which I will talk about. So, as I'd mentioned, you know, people are going to be on both sides of the table for this. Hopefully, if you can stay with me, because I've got a lot of information to go through, it will lead to an honest discussion and some transparency about how I believe many of us in this province are being duped. So, often we have common objectives, and that's largely, I think most people in BC do respect nature and want it around for future generations. So just to give you a brief overview of what I will be talking about, I'm going to start off with a little bit of biology, behavior, and ecology of wolves. I've been doing this program since the wolf cull was initiated in 2015, largely hosting an ecologist who's helped me a lot with this program. I have to recognize Brad Hill for that, thank you. But I also realized that sometimes he's talking up here, and we're missing some of the basics down here. So I wanted to review some of those things and make sure that everybody's on the same page before I go into the dilemma that we're actually facing. I certainly will talk a little bit about mountain caribou, and I'm going to focus in on a specific area. We'll talk about the conservation dilemma that we're facing. It's not only wolves and caribou, it's people, it's moose, it's deer, it's mountain lions. So I'll give you a kind of a big picture feel for that. Talk about some of the relevant science and ecology behind this conundrum that we're dealing with. I'll let you know how to engage if you'd like to, and we'll certainly leave room for questions and discussion. So again, I do have a depth of information, bear with me. Unfortunately, none of this is transferable in short tweets. You know, these are convoluted issues that have multiple layers, they're multifaceted. So it does take some time to get through them. And that's certainly why we will have an intermission once I get through the first part of the program to give you guys a chance to get some coffee and some snacks as well, and we'll rejoin from there. So let's just start with a brief history of wolves. Originally, they were all over Canada. They're circumpolar, so not only North America, but Eurasia. And typically, is that focused okay? Yeah. So everywhere other than the Queen Charlotte's and Prince Edward Island. So things, you know, for millennia, there was, I'll just bring this all up, there was coexistence. among wolves and First Nations. Now, I'm not going to say that killing didn't happen, but if it did, it was usually done with some sort of ceremony, some respect, and it wasn't a wide-scale mass killing program. There certainly are some First Nations, such as the Blackfoot, who saw the wolf as a brother, would not kill the wolf, refused to use poison, something that we're still using in Alberta and Saskatchewan to kill wolves and everything else on the landscape, and that's recently come into my valley in the Columbia Valley, both compound 1080 and strychnine, killing wolves, coyotes, and pet dogs, 4 dogs this winter. So when Europeans arrived, certainly there was a mentality to control nature. We also have to realize that Europeans had just finished eradicating wolves from Europe, pre-North American settlement. So that was the attitude. Also, there was some competition seen for food. Now, whether that was wild game, deer and elk, or especially, when we started farming and having domestic livestock, we viewed wolves as competition for our food. So our history, the tolerance hasn't ever really been high, I don't think, large scale in most parts of North America. That's starting to change now that we have a greater understanding of wolves. The next slide I'll show will actually show you a graph of some of the numbers that I'm talking about, but wolves were at their very lowest, or very low, in the 1930s because of long-term, wide-scale persecution. We were dropping poison on frozen lakes that killed tons of wolves and tons of other large carnivores as well. So there were kind of carnivore cleansing programs. We were doing aerial shooting. Incentives and bounties was almost a form of community building as Europeans spread. Let's get rid of the wolves. Let's work together to do this, right? There was definitely a decline in prey in that time as well, relating to overhunting, severe weather, and habitat loss for sure. Is always an issue and a theme that we're going to come back to again and again in our program today. So even into the late 1980s, we had wide-scale government kill programs in the Yukon, in BC, in Alberta. And even though many of them were ended because they were deemed to be inefficient and not socially acceptable, recently they have resurfaced again. So this chart is actually a really good reflection of the wolf population across most of Western Canada. This is specific to the Bow Valley study, but Paul Paquette, who is my scientific advisor, said that this is actually a very good reflection of what happened across Western Canada. So you can see there's been some ups and downs along the way, and this is certainly not the first time this province has initiated wolf kill programs. So this is just an overview of BC, British Columbia. In the mountain national parks in the 1950s, we killed all of the wolves and many of the other predators too, due to a rabies scare. I believe it was a fox, a rabid fox that was found, but again, let's kill everything. Even after the rabies scare, wardens were still killing wolves in our national parks up until the 70s. Provincial kill in the Musqueam and Ketchikan in the 80s. The Vancouver Island one, I've kind of clumped two different things together. In 82, there was an experiment that began in the Nipkish Valley, and wolves were killed there. It was a couple of years later that that experiment turned into a program, and wolf removal started happening in the north and the south end of the province. I want to make it very clear that in this province, we've been using compound 1080, which is a wide-scale killer, poison, up until the late 90s. Now that finally stopped because the last study that was done in the late 90s showed that 20 to 30% of the baits were taken by non-target species. So again, kind of irresponsible wildlife management. Not only are these poisons indiscriminate killers, they take a long time. So we're talking about prolonged suffering, distress, and agony for several hours. They're also food chain killers. So if something eats this carcass, the carcass is now poison, that travels to whatever feeds on it. Again, this is still used in Alberta. In 2001 to 2011 was some time when there was some wolf killing going on in caribou areas, but not at the scale that we're seeing today. But most people aren't aware of the sterilization program that did happen in the Quesnel Highlands. Again, recent reports, scientific reports that came out last year are confirming ineffective. It was a waste of money. It didn't do anything. A lot of animals certainly did suffer in that process. So, once we successfully we were successful at removing wolves in vast portions of our province. Mostly in the southern portion of the province, kind of from Jasper. I don't know if you guys know that, that's my point of reference in Alberta, but Jasper National Park south, wolves were eliminated and really, really reduced, just based on that graph, right? And when that happened, there were a few changes almost immediately. One was we started changing the way we raised our livestock. We started putting cattle out in remote areas, large herds, unmonitored, because we could. It made sense at the time economically. It was virtually a predator-free landscape. So that changed. We also saw a change in ungulate populations in many parts of North America. This is not just unique to British Columbia. Wolf control and eradication programs were happening in vast parts of this continent. And in many of those areas, we saw an artificially inflated ungulate population, which over time, many people did get used to. We also saw the introduction of some disease in our ungulate populations. So raise your hand if you've heard of chronic wasting disease. Okay, a few people here. I like to talk about it because it's recently resurfaced. Chronic wasting disease is a prion that I believe was first discovered in the United States after the wolf eradication. The elk and the deer really were bunching into herds, and this started spreading. Now, I know many sustenance hunters who say, once chronic wasting disease has arrived in that area, excuse me, I will no longer eat that meat. This is a very, very serious threat, and I'll talk a little bit about it more in detail once I talk about ecology. But with the removal of these carnivores, these were some things that were introduced. And our attitudes, again, I can't say that our tolerance was ever high, but we simply forgot to live with wolves as part of the landscape. And there's been a lot of research to show that where wolves are permanently there, tolerance is much higher because people just see them as part of nature to deal with. When they go and come back and are reintroduced, attitudes are very, very different. There's more animosity, and I'll get into that as well. But just so that you know there is some fear that happens when wolves are reintroduced. I like to paraphrase Chief Dan George: what we don't understand we fear, and what we fear we often destroy. And that's not only for wolves, that's proven to be the case for most large carnivores around the world. So we are now seeing a recolonization of wolves into many parts of their former range. And potentially this could generate economic loss, right? If we've got cattle grazing out on Crown land, unmonitored. That is a real threat. Now the reality is, I work with a lot of ranchers to prevent livestock losses to wolves. You want to have problems with your livestock, kill half a pack. That's how you start, right? And I'll get into a little bit of the biology and behavior why. But certainly, when wolves do recolonize, we get economic loss, high animosity, social stress, and political controversy. And that's definitely all happening in our province right now. Leads to misinformation and a lot of an emotional debate. So I wanted to touch on, what we have learned about wolves, some of the science behind what is happening. And I'll start off with the fact that wolves are social animals. I think everybody in this room knows that, right? The strength of the wolf is the pack. The strength of the pack is the wolf. That's Rudyard Kipling. But what happens to one wolf happens to the entire family. They're all affected. So wolves are not angels and they're not demons, nor are they merely biological statistics or numbers. A wolf is an extremely intelligent animal, socially oriented. They will protect their entire family and care for the injured. So there are a lot of myths and stories and fairy tales about the threats that wolves pose to humans, but the reality is it's us that pose a threat to them, and largely their quality of life, which is something we've started to consider as our society is becoming more compassionate to all living creatures. So the average pack size is usually somewhere between 4 and 8. It really depends on the lay of the land, the landscape, the prey that is available, the number of wolves too. They communicate in many different ways, they cooperate in many different ways, they raise their young together, they hunt as a team, so strong organization skills, and wolves certainly also like to play a lot as well. So a wolf family is very dynamic and changing all the time. I should back up and say I said 4 to 8 wolves. Packs can be as large as 30 in the winter. But that's usually temporary. It would be a few packs joining together, which doesn't last too long, and then they'll separate. Some packs are as small as 2 wolves. There are lone wolves or individual dispersers. It's about 15 to 20% of the population, depending on how we're managing that population, which I'll get into. But those lone wolves are usually trying to join another family or find a mate to start their own family with. Because again, the real ultimate thing behind a wolf is family. So I think it's important to talk about the way that wolves do reproduce. There's a lot of false information about this. To begin with, it is usually only 1 breeding pair in each pack. Again, this changes when we start exploiting a population. Historically, these were referred to as the alpha pair. Right? I like to call them mom and dad because we've learned the alphas aren't the youngest or the strongest. They're older, more experienced wolves. They have a lot to teach the young if they're going to survive in the wild. And they are typically the only breeding pair. Now, let me say there's an exception to everything I'm going to say in this room because wolves are incredibly intelligent and incredibly adaptable. So there have been some cases documented, such as when wolves were returned into Yellowstone, where 2 females had pups in 1 pack. But again, that was a new population expanding, tons of prey, and that will level out over time. Wolves are territorial, so they will kill each other. Apex predators are self-regulating. So when there's fewer wolves, they have more pups. When there's more wolves, they have less pups. They have something called a behaviorally induced reproductive suppression. So remember, I've said there is certain structure and order to every pack. The female will not allow any of the other females to breed. Okay? It's about a 50% survival in that population as well. So again, density dependent, and I want people here to understand that wolves, while I'll talk about what they eat, they're certainly not just eating machines. So as a pack grows, a pack of 2 wolves will kill as often as a pack of 10 wolves. They just can't finish it. So smaller packs kill more per capita. Okay, that's something I want to keep in mind. Anything that I'm saying here, certainly if you want the science behind it, I can back it all up. I didn't put references to that, but there are definitely several studies that I can hand out. And that's regarding whether it's livestock or whether it's natural prey. Wolves spend about 1/4 of their lives with the adults learning how to survive. So, by the time they're 2, they're certainly strong and fit, but they don't have the experience or the skills to determine which animal to target, how to stay safe. It is a difficult life for a wolf, even removing humans. There's starvation, there's weather, there's disease, there's parasites, there's other carnivores out there. Wolves are top predators. Apex predators is another name for this. Now, they're not the only apex predator. We've got several apex predators in British Columbia. And that simply means they're at the top of the food chain. Nothing else eats wolves. They're obligate ungulate carnivores, so they cannot survive on vegetation. About 2 to 5% of their diet is grass and berries, but for the most part, these animals have evolved to eat meat, right? Their main prey are ungulates, which is really a fancy name for the deer family. So deer, elk, moose, caribou, bison, certainly mountain goats as well, you know. But it's largely those larger animals, sharp horns or antlers, sharp hooves. They're fast, they're strong, they will stand their ground and fight back. It's a lot easier for wolves and any carnivore, any predator out there to catch the oldest, youngest, sick, injured, and diseased. I know that's something we've all heard from being young, but guess what? Statistics are proving that and showing that. Now, wolves are opportunistic, so if they get the chance, they will take something fit for sure, but it's a lot more challenging. So most of these ungulates in their prime can outrun wolves, or they'll stand and face them, and a wolf is very unlikely to challenge that. So I've touched on that wolves are important to the environment and to many other species, and I'll go into some of the reasons why. This is a slide that I've just pulled from a recent article about chronic wasting disease. I do have a map in the back if anybody wants to look to see where this disease has occurred or is occurring. It has reached Alberta, and again, it's a very, very serious concern. Some states have started writing other states, please stop killing your wolves because you're going to kill all our deer and elk. What we know is that predators are the best line of defense against this disease. So human hunters are targeting different animals, right? Carnivores almost have a sixth sense. They have to survive. They can tell if an animal has an impacted tooth, maybe a cognitive disorder, something that we wouldn't observe. But that makes the prey act slightly differently. And certainly it's not just wolves. A full guild of carnivores is best because they all hunt in different ways. Wolves and coyotes are coursers, so they're pushing and testing that prey, versus mountain lions, which are more, I want to say pouncers. I know that's not the right word, but that's what's coming to me, stalkers. In any case, wolves keep these animals healthy by keeping herds small and constantly on the move, and certainly by directly removing the diseased animals from that population. If one of these animals dies by themselves, which happens, wolves are there to clean it up, virtually eating all of that carcass. So chronic wasting disease, again, is something that is really, really important, and scientists have determined that our best line of defense is having healthy, robust wolf populations. So again, you look on that map where we don't have chronic wasting disease yet, we still have healthy wolf populations. On some of the fringes of those populations, we've started to see it. But again, it keeps going back to our best line of defense is to have wolves. So top predators help maintain biodiversity in many different ways. Wolves are only successful about 15 to 20% of their hunts in general. So sometimes they'll eat once a week. Usually it's more like every 3 days or so. But when they eat, they gorge. They eat as much as they can, as fast as they can, 1/4 of their own body weight at once. And then they'll move on. Most other predators, like grizzly bears or mountain lions, will guard or bury that prey. But by walking away, wolves open up those leftovers to many other animals sharing that ecosystem. Foxes, cougars, wolverines, mountain lions, ravens. In the Central Rockies in Banff National Park, my organization did a study back in the 90s that determined more than 33 different species were provided for by the leftovers of wolf kills. Now that does include beetles, but we're talking biodiversity here, right? Now, I know several hunters have told me, well, we do the same thing when we leave a gut pile out in the woods. And sure, you do. The difference here is that wolves are providing this year-round regularly versus short times which are inconsistent. All right, let's talk trophic cascades. So this is a fairly new or recent concept, and I think it's pretty amazing because I think nature is pretty amazing, but it's all of the subtle and indirect effects that wolves and apex predators have on not only directly, oops, I shouldn't stand there, the elk. Those straight lines or the solid lines are effects that we know are direct. Yes, we know wolves kill elk, but all of those dotted lines are some indirect effects that happen in that process as well. So Humans, where we have eradicated wolves, have certainly tried to replace the role of wolves. We cannot. We have not been successful in any of those indirect effects. And I'll get into detail in some of those indirect effects so that it's more than just a picture. But I want you to show how many different species, and they're not all on this visual, that wolves and apex predators influence. So their mere presence on the landscape actually influences the behavior of many other species. And that changes the balance and maintains the balance in biodiversity. Trophic cascades. That is a fantastic source, just to scientific source. This came from an article, what was it, 2014, saying that 3/4 of the world's large carnivores are now in decline. So wherever they do exist, we certainly have a global responsibility to preserve and maintain them, again, as part of a system. There's also, if anybody's interested in trophic cascades, a great book called The Wolf's Tooth by Christina Eisenberg. Pretty easy reading. And it goes on to show, it's not only wolves that create these things. One of the first documented was actually sea otters and kelp and sea urchins, right? Same thing with starfish. But again, it's all of these ripple effects that the top predators create that go through every single layer of the food chain or the energy flow in that ecosystem. So, I believe these animals are invaluable and irreplaceable. Like I said, we cannot duplicate their roles. So, raise your hand if you've been to Yellowstone. Okay, a lot of people here. It's on my bucket list. I haven't been there yet. Raise your hand if you know that it's Canadian wolves that were reintroduced into Yellowstone. Okay, a lot of people are familiar with this, which I think is fantastic. I think the world should actually know, because this has been called one of the greatest ecological restoration projects in history. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about it, so bear with me if you already know. But this slide that I'm showing you is from National Geographic 2010. I brought the copy with me if anybody wants to see it. So, Yellowstone is the first national park in the world, home of Yogi Bear, now becoming very, very famous for its wolves. Back in the 1920s, we were afraid of wolves. We feared them. We didn't like them. We also wanted more deer and elk in that park for people to see as well as hunt. So in the 20s, we killed all of the large predators in Yellowstone. The last wolf was shot in 1926. Big mistake. It didn't take long before that park started changing. By the 1950s, it was very different. Many small animals, insects, fish, songbirds, beavers had either died or left the park. Huge drop in biodiversity. So 2 researchers came in and started doing some studies, and they really wanted to know what was happening with the beavers and what was happening to the riparian sections, because there were no more aspen and willow trees. And what they determined was that when wolves were still on the landscape, the deer and elk would eat a little bit here, and then they'd eat a little bit over here, and eat a little bit here. But they were constantly on the move, and they were constantly vigilant. Without wolves there, they had no reason to behave that way anymore. So they started spending time in areas where they were easily exposed, in valley bottoms, and often beside streams. And they ate, and they ate, and they ate, and they ate. They overgrazed, they overbrowsed. All of that vegetation is important for many of those other species that I've mentioned, but most importantly, they did not allow the aspen or willows to grow. So we'd seen a huge drop in biodiversity. Aspen and willows, they provide shade, they prevent soil erosion. Beavers use them to build their dams, creating wetlands, marshes, ponds, home and habitat for all of the animals I'd mentioned. By raising that water table, it also helps all of the vegetation grow back. This wasn't happening. The park dried out, huge forest fires in the 90s, big drop in biodiversity, tons of deer and elk. But they're starving. There's nothing left for them to eat. The old, injured, diseased were all still part of those herds. So the wardens knew the park was in trouble. They wanted to help. They started shipping elk to other parks, which were soon full. Then they began killing them by the thousands. It was very sad, and it was very sick. And it took a long time. It was finally in 1995 and 96, 31 wolves were reintroduced into that area. Now, simultaneous with this, there was a beaver reintroduction program. I believe it was just north of the park. But the bottom line is, in a very short amount of time, within about 8 years, that park rebalanced itself. The wolf population went up, the deer and elk population went down, but more importantly, these animals started moving again, releasing the pressure from the stream sides, which allowed the aspen and willow trees to grow back. And as they grew back, the beaver returned. Well, following the beaver, all of those other species that I've mentioned also came back. Songbirds that hadn't been seen in the park since the 1950s returned by themselves by putting the top predator where it originally belonged. Now, is this one wonky study? No, the same study's been done in Banff National Park. Mark Hebblewhite's thesis. Remember I said we eradicated wolves due to the rabies scare? Well, when they started coming back, we saw an increase in beavers, an increase in songbirds. Basically, everything started benefiting from that. So, if it's not a wolf, it's a shark. It's a mountain lion. It's an apex predator that has evolved over millennia to regulate ecosystems in this way. Now, ecosystems aren't static, right? There certainly are oscillations, but that is nature. So just to kind of reiterate the ecology of fear, how wolves really keep animals moving across the landscape. I think this one speaks for itself. Okay, so let's talk about how far we've come. I want to talk about caribou a little bit before I get into the relevant science behind this. So the Latin name, if anybody's looking for it, is Rangifer tarandus. Caribou are also circumpolar, so the whole, Eurasia as well, but they're called reindeer there. All right, I'm going to show you a series of maps. The take-home message from this is that the classification of caribou is very messy. Okay, we've got several different schemes out there. Whether you're looking at the federal scheme, the provincial scheme, some researchers even have their own scheme, whether it's deep snow or shallow snow. But what I want to show you, we have 3 main types of caribou in Canada: the Prairie caribou, the woodland caribou, and what one am I missing? Barren ground caribou. So the barren ground are in here, our Prairie are up here. This green section, and even this blue section and over here, these are all woodland caribou. So again, full green here, this is the extent of woodland caribou. Some have decided to break it down. So these are woodland caribou. Genetically, they're identical. Behaviorally, they're different. I also like to show this slide. This is how they've broken them down into significant units worth preserving. The pale yellow here that you see is previous caribou range. And you can see it historically was all connected, right? And that's very important for gene flow. Look at some of these remnant populations. I call them islands of extinction. They're separated. There's no way for animals to rejoin each other. Some, like the South Selkirk herd, are down to 14 caribou. The main difference here, again, these are all woodland caribou, and I'll get into the differences in a moment. But some call these ones the yellow are the deep snow, the blue are the shallow snow. But again, genetically identical, says the most recent science. We haven't found any different. So in any case, there are subpopulations of caribou in British Columbia and across Canada. But then it gets broken down even further into what we call ecotypes. So an ecotype can be based on genetics. It could be based on behavior, based on morphology. This is specifically to behavior. So the mountain ecotype, which is most of what I'm going to focus on, I'll get into a moment. But basically for all woodland caribou, both the boreal and the mountain, caribou are slow to reproduce. They have their first calves when they're about 3 years old, and it's 1 a year. Okay, so very slow reproduction. Caribou are very sensitive to disturbance. So it's very, very easy to displace these animals. And I'll get into more details about that. A large part of how these animals have evolved and their daily activity is around avoiding predators and predator avoidance. Also actually avoiding other ungulate species as well. They're able to isolate themselves because these caribou survive off lichen in the winter months. No other ungulate can survive off of that. The mountain caribou need contiguous forests, and I say arboreal lichen and altitudinal migration. I'm going to link those both together because mountain caribou have evolved to avoid predators by, in the winter months, going to the very top of the mountain into the alpine. They've got these ginormous hooves which act as snowshoes, and they eat the lichen that grows off the trees, standing on top of that snowpack. And historically, predators weren't able to access them in those zones. The altitudinal migration happens twice a year, so they move around with different seasons, whether it's to avoid insects or to calve. So it really is every elevation that is important to mountain caribou. And that's why they're often referred to as the canary in the coal mine, a reflection of how healthy that ecosystem is. The boreal ecotype eats ground lichen. So they also, their hooves allow them to dig and access this. These are also animals that have evolved for cold, cold weather. They have excellent insulation. Their noses, virtually every part of their body is covered by hair. They've got short appendages and short ears. So they're cold weather wilderness animals. Another reason to avoid their prey or other ungulate species, why they want to be isolated, is partly disease transfer, like I'd mentioned with chronic wasting disease, right? Brainworm is something that is transmissible between deer and caribou. We haven't seen that in BC yet, but it's part of their evolution. So boreal, like forest and muskeg, and its terrestrial lichen, there is no arguing that these animals are in decline. But when we're talking about conservation, are we talking about an individual? Are we talking about a herd? Are we talking about a ecotype? Are we talking about a species? These are things that we want to consider. Coastal wolves are a unique ecotype. They're actually genetically unique, behaviorally unique, and morphologically unique. Do they have any protection whatsoever? No, they don't. So everybody at this point, I believe, agrees, it's pretty much universally accepted that the ultimate cause of caribou decline is ongoing habitat destruction. Since the 1970s, biologists have been saying, protect more caribou habitat, that's what they need. Well, we haven't done very well with that. So that is the ultimate cause. Now, the change in the habitat over time has certainly led to change in dynamics between caribou and not only wolves, but all predators. So I'll touch on this later, but no caribou herds in British Columbia exist where there's not a guild of predators. There's many different predators that live with caribou. This is some great science, Witnessing Extinction. It was one of the first that said, in looking at all of the decades of research, caribou movement, caribou habitat, ultimately it is the habitat that is leading to their decline. So caribou survival depends on balancing all of these different factors. Remember I said that they're very, very vulnerable and do not like people. So they can be pushed from one area to another. They will move willingly into predator-rich zones to avoid humans, industry, infrastructure, whatever it is. So sometimes they're pushed out of their prime feeding grounds into areas that are where they are more exposed and that are not really as holistic or beneficial to them. So again, there's a lot of research. Wasser et al. Did a great one. He summarized caribou are so skittish they'd rather hang out somewhere where the food isn't as plentiful if it's further from human impact. He used scat-sniffing dogs, actually, and studied a lot of caribou turds, and was able to determine that their stress hormones were a lot higher around even just seismic lines than they were around their natural predators. So I mentioned they can be displaced, which creates food stress, hormone stress I just touched on, and all of these things are happening in most areas where there are mountain caribou. Snowmobiles, helicopters, cat skiing, heli skiing, all of these things displace caribou and increase the stress hormones in them. And we know stress hormones are not good for anybody. It's not healthy over the long term, right? And then these are just the full references. Like I said, if anybody wants these papers afterwards, just come talk to me. I can certainly follow up and make sure that you get a copy of all of this information. With what's happening in Victoria today, I just had to put this up. But one of the questions I'll be asking is, what are we prioritizing? So again, I've said since the 1970s, caribou biologists have been recommending protect more habitat, protect more habitat. 2015 was when the wolf cull started officially, but I want to go back before that because 2007 was a pretty important year as well. In that year, the Mountain Caribou Recovery Implementation Plan came out, and we started to hear government proclaiming that we've protected 2.2 million hectares of caribou habitat. Fantastic. In some of the recent documents, they've changed that tone and admitted that, well, most of that habitat was actually previously protected. We're talking national parks, provincial parks, ungulate winter ranges. What was newly protected was previously logged at high elevation, so it's of no value to the timber industry. Areas that were too steep to log, but also virtually useless for caribou. So we've ended up with basically a checkerboard or a patchwork quilt. And again, caribou need contiguous forests to survive. Not only is it the clear cutting, it's a lot of access roads in there. We've got a lot of mineral exploration still happening, as well as forestry roads and commercial recreation. So certainly their habitat has been lost or impoverished over time. The fact of the matter is that is still happening. And that's what I'll get into when I give you the case example. This, you see the caribou on the road there. 2 weeks after the wolf kill was announced, 15 caribou, that South Selkirk herd, were all on the side of the road licking up antifreeze from a semi that had overheated. That could have been it right there. The driver got booed as he was chasing the caribou away because people were photographing them. Fortunately, these animals process antifreeze a little bit differently, so that wasn't it. But there is a de-icer put on the Samo-Creston Pass, which does actually attract caribou to it, and there have been several vehicle collisions. Can anybody think of any other threats that might be affecting caribou that I haven't mentioned yet? Hunters? There is still hunting of caribou happening, you're right. Not in the areas where the wolf kill is happening, although there could be some poaching and some accidents. But we are still hunting woodland caribou across British Columbia. We certainly are. So again, this is where I say what we have is herds and subpopulations that are in serious decline. Some are stable, some are increasing, many are decreasing. A lot of that, again, has to do with the fragmentation. So I think I've pretty much touched on this, just that they have a unique food niche in surviving off of that lichen, and those other adaptations as well. And this is something that has surfaced fairly recently. So there's lots of different types of competition among wildlife. There's direct, there's indirect. So whether it's for resources, nesting materials, or let's say an osprey going after an eagle to catch a fish, that would be direct, right? Apparent competition is a little bit harder to determine and detect. But Rob Soroya, he's done his PhD thesis on this. There's some definite good science behind this. And I'll just summarize what it is. This is a slide from me teaching grade 8s what is happening in caribou habitat. So imagine the green is your old growth forest. The white patches are your clear cuts. And then the white stripes are either roads or snowmobile trails. So what is effectively happening is that when we change that old growth forest, we log it all, we clear cut it, we get early cereal growth, new different types of vegetation, which is very, very attractive to what we call primary prey, deer and elk and moose. They really, really like that. And following them are predators. So if there's an increased prey load, there's going to be an increase in the predator load. And the apparent competition theory is that because there's now more wolves in that area hunting moose, if they bump into a caribou, they might hunt that as well, right? So that, again, is the theory behind apparent competition. I will talk more about the snowmobile trails right now. So the image showing that trail, basically, as soon as we create a snowpack, we've created a highway, not only for wolves, but any other predators, to access caribou where they previously couldn't. They're much more efficient at getting around. And these highways don't only last through the winter months when people are snowmobiling. This is a shot from the spring. So when everything else around is slushy and sloppy and hard to get through, we've still got this predator highway virtually. And again, we're still snowmobiling in critical caribou habitat. That's been admitted by the government several times, and in Rob Soroya's proposal to expand the kill. Now the slide here is to show you an area that is prime caribou habitat, gently rolling hills, old growth trees, that is still open to snowmobiling. So snowmobiling disrupts them in different ways. Like I said, they're sensitive, they can easily be displaced, they don't like noise, they don't like being bugged, but it's also the snowpack in these trails that is really, really leading to a change in the landscape. What I want to focus in right now is Planning Unit 3A, because that's what I'm most familiar with. I live in Golden, right here. I've got a lot of friends, and a lot of new friends who have come out of retirement asking people across BC to help. So that's where I'll be focusing. And I like to call this a review of promises made and promises broken. So again, this is Planning Unit 3A. Again, in that 2007, I said it was a pretty important year. Government biologists determined if we are going to maintain the herd of caribou in this planning unit, we need to set aside a minimum of 34,000 hectares. That was science. Those were government scientists. I call it the Valdal report, but the source is right there. Well, what actually happened that year for economic reasons was that 10,000 hectares were decided to be protected. Again, of that 10,000, some of it was already status quo. So it was about 7,400, I believe, that was newly protected for caribou in that 2007 plan. That's not expected to have a self-sustaining caribou herd, but wait a minute, it gets even worse. 4 years later, there's a biodiversity amendment, and more than 6,000 hectares of that protected habitat is given back to the logging industry, old growth forest, in compensation for what had been lost to protecting caribou. Are we serious about protecting caribou here? So virtually that's, about 1% of what scientists recommended. But this is where I say, you know what, it's not only science, this is common sense. Go over these caribou zones using Google Earth And you can see the fragmentation. And understanding the life requirements of these animals and how they have evolved evolutionarily, their habitat is no longer available to them. They've outlived it. And that's not the fault of wolves. So I say that Revelstoke fails. D, it is not doing well. The plan right now actually is to log all of that virgin forest. So caribou are not the only unique or endangered species in there. The inland temperate rainforest hosts many, many species. I'm working with Valhalla Wilderness Society. There's a petition there to actually protect some of this old growth, which the government hasn't recognized yet. But they've brought in lichenologists for one day who are discovering new species, or discovering species that they thought only existed on the coast. So again, these are very, very biodiverse areas that do need protecting. And I'm thrilled with some of the protection that's happened with the Great Bear Rainforest. I think that's something that we can be proud of, not only in BC, but in Canada. But we really need to extend that to the interior as well. Some of those trees are 2,000 to 3,000 years old. And it's unlikely that this ecosystem will regenerate once it's destroyed. You can't unscramble an egg, right? Especially with factors like climate change and pollution these days. So simply put, the habitat piece is not in place in Planning Unit 3A. This is an image, again, critical caribou habitat less than 3 years ago. So the result in Revelstoke is not only aerial gunning has begun, but Rob Soroya's thesis was a moose reduction program. That moose population was dropped by 70%. Most of it happened over a period of 3 years, but we want to maintain those low moose densities. We also want to start killing white-tailed deer and targeting mountain lions. Now, in the South Peace wolf cull, there have been black bears killed when they come within 25 kilometers of the maternal pen. So we're starting to talk about a bloodbath here, as far as I'm concerned. This is not just wolves, this is multiple species now being targeted as we continue to destroy critical caribou habitat. I just want to follow up with, I don't believe that our Species at Risk Act was intended for this type of management. Which brings us to the conservation dilemma. And it was in January of 2015 that the government announced that they would start to kill wolves in 2 specific areas of the province, the South Peace and the South Selkirks. And it was only last year that it expanded to Revelstoke. Now, originally, they wouldn't say how long this would last. But any wolf biologist knows that these are long-term. We're talking decades. So finally, the government admitted or said, okay, we'll do this for 5 years as an experiment, and then we'll review it. There is a lack of scientific evidence of functional effectiveness for wolf culls. You look in history where they have occurred, killing wolves does not increase ungulate populations in the long term. So Bob Hayes was the biologist of the Yukon for 20 years. He killed wolves. He has since said, this is not the way to go. It's extremely expensive, it creates great community divide, and at the end of the day, you got the same number of wolves and the same number of ungulates. As well, it's morally repugnant, and it's a biological disaster with some of those repercussions. So he's got stacks of scientific papers, but I really recommend, he's got a book that summarizes it all very well, Wolves of the Yukon, and he actually is a part-time BC resident too. So that's one example that I can give you. I also want to touch on Alberta, because Alberta certainly does have a wolf cull going on as well. It's actually, BC is riding the tail of what was initiated in Alberta. So Alberta started its wolf cull in 2005 in one particular area just north of Jasper or Hinton. It's known as the Little Smoky Caribou Range. There's about 100 caribou in that population. Since 2005, we've killed more than 1,200 wolves in that area. So this picture is actually outdated because this was when it was, this stopped about 4 years ago. This caribou habitat is 96% developed, mostly by oil and gas infrastructure, but that has actually increased since the wolf cull started. We are still using and expanding our footprint in caribou habitat. So there was a paper that came out. Herview was the lead author of this experimental wolf cull after the first 7 years. And basically, the scientific literature says there was no difference in female survivorship. There was no difference in calf recruitment. There has been no change in that caribou population. We've now killed 1,200 wolves. We've also killed a minimum of 233 non-target species because this program also uses strychnine. Again, an indiscriminate killer. It's a poison. Any carnivore attracted to that bait is going to suffer and then pass it up the food chain. So again, this one's not working. So on a small scale, culling is very, very ineffective because wolves reproduce quickly. The more we exploit them, we see an increase in reproductive hormones. We're fragmenting that social structure, so we've got more breeders. You can actually increase density, but the wolves have smaller territories. We see more lone wolves and more dispersers. That's the reproductive capacity. The other thing is, if there are wolves in the surrounding area, all you're doing is creating a vacuum. Those wolves are just going to move into that vacant territory. So again, every single year, you're just killing more and more and more. Actually, the second year of the Alberta experiment, there were more wolves in the area than there were in the first year. So on a small scale, doesn't work. On a large scale, we have some serious negative ecological repercussions that I've talked about in Yellowstone National Park, but I'll bring that home by using the example of Algonquin Provincial Park, which is in Ontario. The wolves were not going to be wiped out there, but they were very, very heavily hunted in the winter months. The deer would leave the protection of that park into deer wintering grounds, the wolves would follow them, and they wouldn't make it back. So they're constantly losing family members, constantly recruiting family members. We saw that change their ecological role. They were no longer bringing down moose. They didn't have the experience or the skills to do so. They were not reusing den sites. Their territories were smaller. What actually happened around Algonquin Provincial Park was they established buffer zones so that wolves and coyotes couldn't be hunted or trapped in the 39 townships around them. After that, we didn't see the wolf population skyrocket, no. But they started dying of natural causes, and we saw a shift to kin-based families. This is how wolves have evolved over millennia. So I've already, kind of mentioned this point that all of the caribou in British Columbia live in multi-predator systems. You might notice the top 3 slides, the mountain lion, the coyote, and the wolf active in winter, are all using snowmobile trails. That's that highway that I talked about, the path of least resistance. Both types of bears live with these caribou, black and grizzly, wolverines. I didn't put links up there, but these are multi-predator systems. So I want to make it clear that it is very, very difficult to extrapolate from one system and say the exact same thing is happening here. Those generalizations we have to be cautious with because there are different guilds in different areas, okay? But again, for the most part, all multi-predator systems. So let's first talk about what we're actually seeing in terms of what is eating and killing the caribou. Some of this information is older and hasn't been updated, but this is for the southern mountain caribou herd, so all of the yellow ones that I've talked about, excluding the South Selkirk herd specifically. I don't know why that herd around Creston wasn't included in this. But in any case, the top predator of mountain caribou was mountain lions. Next on the list was bears, then it was wolverines. Fourth on that list was wolves. There's been another great paper that has come out showing that Mountain lions, although they are an apex predator, they're actually, what's the word I'm looking for? They're dominated by grizzly bears and wolves. So grizzly bears and wolves in the ecosystem may depress their population, change their behavior. Again, when we saw wolves becoming reintroduced or reintroducing themselves, I should say, into the mountain national parks, the mountain lions started moving further up in elevation, avoiding the valley bottoms. Now, let's see, in 2012 there was a translocation. Some caribou were moved from the north to the South Selkirk herd. What happened to those caribou? Well, 6 were killed by mountain lions, 3 by vehicles, 2 by wolves, several unknown, and 1 was killed during transportation. Why weren't bears or wolverines killing them? Because they focus on calves. These were all adults, and it was happening in the winter. Rob Soroya's thesis, like I said, Revelstoke, from 2003 to 2010, so you've got to read beyond the abstract in these reports. 247 wolf kills, 0 caribou, 267 wolf scats, 0 caribou in that scat. Now, I'm not saying that wolves don't eat caribou. Of course they do, and they should. But again, so do many other predators, and the proportion of their feeding is actually quite minimal. Now again, this top study, 2005, since then the wolf population has increased. I want to mention that, right? But I would still say they are not the most, they're not the predator that is consuming most caribou. When we go to the northern BC, it's a little different. Wolves are the primary predators of caribou. And then it goes bears, and then cougars, and then wolverines. So you even it out across the whole province, it's actually bears that kill the majority of caribou, when and where it happens. So let's just take a look back at the Alberta study. For 12 years now, we've been killing 1 single species in that, targeting wolves. We've removed 1,200 of them. We've seen no increase in that caribou number. Why not? Well, what's going on? Perhaps the other predators are compensating for the wolves. We're not really sure, but we do know it's certainly ineffective if we are going to remove 1 predator from a full guild. So if we're serious about saving caribou, let's kill all of the predators. That's essentially what we'd have to do. Now, please don't leave this room thinking that I advocate for that, because I certainly don't. It is morally repugnant. As well, we would then have to do deer culls, elk culls, coyote culls for a very, very, very long time, because we'd be creating significant imbalance. So can we save the caribou? I don't know. That's a good question at this point. Should we be putting all of our resources into saving them? Probably, but we should at least choose something that's going to work. So the carrying capacity of caribou habitat. Remember I showed you on those maps, we've got some islands of extinction. We're unlikely in many of these areas to even see a short-term change in caribou population, regardless of how many predators you kill, because the habitat cannot support them. These areas are no longer able to support self-sustaining caribou herds. And it's going to take 60, 80, maybe 100 years before the habitat recovers enough so that caribou populations are self-sustaining again, if the habitat recovers. I like to use the example. I'm going to raise your hand if you've heard about the media. There's a lot of media coverage right now about the movement of caribou in the Slate Islands in Ontario. Nobody here's heard of that? Okay, I'm getting plastered with Facebook saying, the wolves have decimated the caribou in a very short period of time. So caribou swam over to the island in a very short period of time. They went from 10 to 700. No predators. They were starving to death. Remember what I've told you about Yellowstone before the elk were reintroduced? So this is coming from Brent Patterson, Ministry of the Environment. There are still caribou that are starving to death, and wolves aren't even scavenging them. So the issue in this situation certainly is not wolves. Kill all the wolves you'd like. If there's nothing to eat, how are the caribou going to survive? That's pretty much it. Small populations. So most biologists will tell you for a minimum viable population in the medium term, you need at least 100 individuals. Some of them are now saying, well, that's actually about 500 individuals that we need. Because when the numbers are so low, we start to see inbreeding, which reduces the fitness, the ability to reproduce, the ability to survive. It's called an extinction vortex when we get into that situation. Again, small herds, this is when stochastic events can happen. Shit happens, right? Whether it's an avalanche, a vehicle collision on that Salmo-Creston Pass. Are we prepared to kill wolves for decades when an uncontrollable event could wipe out this small herd? This is the elephant in the room, climate change. Again, a very, very serious issue because these herds are no longer connected through wildlife corridors. And we've already seen animals naturally starting to migrate further north or to higher elevations. Well, they need a way to be able to get there. Climate change, this is basically unpredictable. We don't know what will happen. We don't know if these old growth forests will recover themselves if we do stop logging. It's an unknown and it's an unknowable at this point. But it is something to be factored in, definitely, or to address or recognize that's there. And then the last thing really is animal welfare. It is its own science this day and age. So the methods that we're using, it's not just the sheer number of wolves that we're killing, it's the means that we're doing so. So the two main tactics in the provincial wolf kill are aerial gunning and neck snares. Neither of them are accepted as humane forms of euthanasia through our Canadian Council of Animal Care guidelines. Now the experts that determine that, this is voluntary and BC hasn't signed on to meet those guidelines. But those guidelines certainly exist. We are using the American veterinary guidelines, basically, for humane euthanasia. But even they say, if you're going to kill an animal, it's one clean shot to the brain. You're not going to be able to do that in an aircraft. So the next best thing would then be one clean shot to the heart or lung area. Well, that's pretty much virtually impossible. So we've got a moving aircraft chasing multiple wolves, firing as often as you can, multiple bullets, chasing them to exhaustion. Many of these animals linger in their death. They do make it into the forest with multiple bullet shots, where they die quite slowly. A lot of these areas are inaccessible, so helicopters can't actually land and finish the job. So we're talking, again, prolonged suffering. Neck snares, again, do not only target wolves. So many other species can be caught, any carnivore that's attracted to the bait. The thing with wolves is it's their anatomy. They've got very thick neck musculature and a reinforced trachea. So very seldom does that snare get to the exact right spot. What we end up seeing often is blood going up, but it's not able to come down. So wolves develop something called jellyhead. And again, this is ours. Sarah Dubois, resident of BC, has just participated in an international scientific paper on the consensus of principles for ethical wildlife control, shaming Western Canada for what it's doing to the world. And again, we are now receiving international condemnation for the way that we are treating sentient beings. Who gives us permission to do this? So let's get into some of the ethical questions. I can't tell you and I don't want to tell you what to think. But these are some things that I want you to consider and start asking yourself. Is it okay to kill one species to recover another? Again, this is a moral issue. There's going to be different perspectives on this. I know when the cull was first initiated, the Ktunaxa Nation stood up and said, no, it's not okay to kill one species to save another. Personally, I agree. Even if the science said that it would work, I would be opposed to this on ethical grounds. Is it okay to kill one species to recover another when we're the ones that have caused the decline of that species? Is it okay to kill one species to save another while we're still destroying their critical habitat? Is it okay to kill one species in a multi-predator system when it's very unlikely to have an effect? So with the caribou plans, some of the language in it was saying that it is socially unacceptable to kill bears. I agree with that. It is socially unacceptable. BC has, recently said that. But why is it okay to kill wolves? And how long are we prepared to do this for? What's the end goal here? Do we want caribou to reach a self-sustaining population? Do we want that old-growth forest large enough? Again, regardless of what the goal is, it's going to take decades before we get there. I've talked about the requirements of caribou. And I've also got this image up on the wall over there. This was a map largely done by the Valhalla Wilderness Society, who continues to document the destruction of the old growth in critical caribou habitat. So what I want you to see from this, all of the highlighted red is ungulate winter range, which should be protected for caribou. Again, you'll see those faded patches, a lot of that has previously been logged. The outlines in red are areas that were logged within the past 4 years. Those are some images from that. The green sprouts coming up haven't been protected. They probably should have been. So we're logging right up to the edges of caribou habitat, bringing in moose, bringing in deer, bringing in elk, bringing in a load of other predators. Are we serious about saving caribou? So this is considered an experiment because, like I've said, there's no evidence that this is going to work. Over the past 3 winters, it's been a total or a minimum of 402 wolves in this program. So this kind of shows you the area. I do have this up on the board there too if anybody wants a better look. Most of it is happening in the south piece. The South Selkirk, I believe it's about 26 wolves we've killed now. Again, there's 14 caribou there now. And then in Revelstoke, where we initiated it last year, there were 11 wolves killed. I'm sure this number has gone up because the program it's happening right now. I don't have this year's numbers, but you can bet it's definitely happening. And unfortunately, the habitat destruction continues. So recently, there was a draft plan to recover caribou made between the province and the feds. And in this draft plan, they still say, well, we need to recognize and protect critical caribou habitat. Why haven't we done that already? Again, we've been recommending that since the 1970s. Now, once they identify what needs to be protected, they'll protect it, but only if it's untenured. Well, we're specifically talking now about the South Peace herd in that area. Virtually all of that land is tenured. In fact, most of it has multiple tenures on it. So are we actually going to protect more habitat for caribou? Are we serious about it? I'm willing to fence these areas off completely, but we can't even keep snowmobiles out of them. So the proposal is to continue killing wolves, moose, deer, etc., in the medium term. So that's 40 to 60 years bare minimum, right? I believe this is unwarranted, unscientific, and unethical. So these are some other things that I want people to consider. Science is a tool that we can use to inform us, but it doesn't give us permission to cause harm. It's very important that we start to distinguish between management and conservation. Right now we're doing a lot of management of wildlife, but not management for wildlife. And simply put, the ends don't justify the means. So if we are serious about protecting mountain caribou, then let's protect their critical habitat, stop logging the old-growth forests, and stop scapegoating wolves. I think that's a distraction from what continues to happen to their habitat, I should say. So I feel there has been a lack of adequate media coverage on this issue. I think a lot of people are being duped. Your tax dollars are funding this experiment. We're still logging the old growth. Is that conservation? That being said, the opposition does continue to grow. There are many independent scientists and several NGOs across Canada, across the continent, and internationally that when they learn this, they are voicing opposition. So in BC, there's more than 20 NGOs that have publicly said, I oppose the wolf call. Nationally, there's more than 10 nonprofits. Internationally, we've got more than 22 nonprofit organizations. Canadian eco-tour operators. We also have, I don't have Ocean Adventures on here. That's not you, that's not two, but they should be. And I know there's at least 10 different wildlife tourism groups in British Columbia that have publicly stepped up and said, I am opposed to this. So you want to talk economy? Yes, for sure, ecotourism done sustainably and responsibly is a huge boost to our economy. Yellowstone, since they've reintroduced wolves, brings in more than $35 million each year in tourism. More than 150,000 people flock each winter to witness predator-prey interactions because it's very rare to see this anywhere else in the world. Now, just as excited as tourists are to flock to that area, so are the foresters and ecologists because we have the return of the aspens and willows, some of the most important plants to that entire ecosystem. Definitely, many scientists and biologists have opposed this as well. The list is longer, again, than what I've put up there. There were just 15 that signed on in a letter submitted to the Alberta government. It's all of the exact same arguments for what's happening in British Columbia. So again, Paul Paquette sits on the IUCN as a wild canid advisor. He's been studying wolves and large carnivores for decades and is considered a world expert. Some other Canadian notables, Robert Bateman, Charlie Russell, John Marriott, Rafe Mair. Rafe Mair, when he was elected in 1979, the very first thing he did as an environment minister was stop the wolf call. I've had a lot of conversations with him, and he was very, very upset with the backward slide, the regression in our wildlife management and policies. Pacific Wild has an online petition, last count, and this was about a month ago, 233,000, and that number is still increasing. So there is strong opposition to this, but it hasn't been heard enough yet. So again, I say wolves are scapegoats. The real threat to biodiversity is humans. And I think most of us are kind of on board with that concept. How much are we willing to share these increasingly busy landscapes? So if we are serious about protecting caribou, again, yes, we do need to identify and protect their critical habitats. Stop logging the old-growth forest. Stop scapegoating wolves. Let's focus on the real issues here. These are some of the decision makers that I urge you to contact, specifically the BC Premier. If nobody else, at least write to the Premier. I do have a handout sheet at the back with this contact information. It's also online, and I encourage everybody to speak to your MLA. Bring it up the chain. Talk to your peers as well.
Sadie, I should say that that's the biggest way that the government listens to us.
MLA?
About banning the hunting of grizzly bears.
100%. And again, it's something Rafe Mair talked about a lot, is how we've forgotten to use the system. That these are representatives of the public. And their job is to carry our message higher up. That's democracy. I do encourage contacting the federal minister as well, because the Species at Risk Act is largely coming into play in this, and we have to let them know predator control is not an option. It's not a viable option. This is actually in Banff National Park. I'm going to take a moment to say I've been involved in some scientific review of the deer culling that's happening in the East Kootenays. No science behind that. No objectives, no parameters, no proper documentation. But people don't want deer eating their tulips, so let's kill them. So for the most part, the environment determines the number of prey, and that determines the number of predators. It's not the other way around. It's a basic concept, but it's a very important one. I just want to take a moment to say that even though I am focusing specifically on the wolf cull as my presentation issue, it's really a drop in the pan compared to what's happening across the province. Recreationally, we kill more than 1,200 wolves every single year for sport. Nobody eats wolves. Last year, we killed more than 200 wolves in a period of 3 months where they came into conflict with livestock. Much of that livestock is still grazed on Crown land, public land. So we're killing not only wolves, but other carnivores for the price of a steak. The wolf is the only large game animal that you do not need a specific tag or license for. You need your general hunting permit. More than half of the province has no bag limits and no closed seasons. So you're allowed to kill them from 9 to 12 months of the year. No quotas, so there's no limit on how many you can catch. We have killing contests, believe it or not, in British Columbia. Now, I should say the only other species that is treated like this is their very close cousin, the coyote. They don't fare much better than wolves do. So I just want to touch again on what happens when we do indiscriminately kill wolves. And a lot of it has to do with disrupting that social order of the pack. Again, we see an increase in stress hormones, an increase in reproduction rate, an increase in density, smaller territories, more lone wolves that are more likely to create conflict because they don't have the experience or the numbers to be able to target their natural prey. There lots and lots. There's tons of more research coming out all of the time to show this. There were just 2 recent articles that came out. I put the top one in. Killing wolves to prevent predation on livestock may protect one farm but harm neighbors. Yes, that's what we see. There have been a lot of studies showing the more wolves you kill, the more livestock are killed the following year. Again, it's this social chaos. When things are in balance, just like us, we all get along. When that is turned into an exploitation, we start stealing, we start fighting, we start raping, we start behaving very, very, very differently. Same with these animals. So they cannot be managed like ungulates by numbers. We need to be preserving and conserving intact family units that will self-regulate themselves over time. Why do we care? Again, wolves are very, very sentient beings. They're extremely intelligent and highly social. We don't allow this for dolphins or elephants, other animals that have this type of sentience. Why is it okay to treat our wolves like this? They maintain balance and biodiversity, so very important for the ecosystem. And the fact of the matter is, human-caused mortality is the biggest threat to wolves in Canada. And I'm not just talking about changing numbers, because what happens to one wolf happens to that entire family. They mourn. I've seen it. Often trappers will kill an entire family because they're hanging around in that area. I don't know if they want to help. I'm not exactly sure what's going on, but sometimes an entire family can be wiped out in that way. They've certainly got intrinsic spiritual and cultural value. The slide on the right, I don't know if anybody can see it here, and it might even just be my imagination. But this is, I'm doing research with the Hanigwitchin, part of the Tsilhqot'in First Nation. It's a wolf feeding ecology study. I've been brought in to do some baseline research because there have been a lot of government-funded wolf and wild horse kill programs based on anecdote. So I'm in there to get some baseline information. The Hanigwitchin are a horse people, culturally. So this is one of the art pieces that I've seen at the last gas station before I go into the community, but I'm pretty certain I see a wolf there. Again, ceremonial mask for the Tsilhqot'in. These are outstanding achievements of nature. I mean, nature is pretty splendid, and top predators are one of the greatest achievements. So I believe there is a critical need for change in wolf management. We need to align policy with the biology, behavior, and ecology of these animals. We need to include ethics. Yes, let's factor in the economy as well. Not only the wildlife viewing potential, but one of the things that wolves do is also control mesopredator populations. So coyotes and smaller, the middle predators which hunt smaller animals. And those economically often create more damage with humans than wolves do. Well, you can't control coyote populations by killing them. The states have been trying to do it for decades. They don't have those bounties anymore because they're completely ineffective. The only way to control that mesopredator population is having that apex predator. It's behavior, largely. Now, where wolves aren't there, sometimes a coyote is a top predator, and it does have an essential role in nature, 100%. But that's another thing that we saw in Yellowstone. With the removal of wolves, coyote population doubled. They started forming packs. They couldn't replace the role of the wolves because they couldn't take down the largest prey, but they were killing far more pronghorn and having a large impact on that species. So there is a great video, if anybody is interested, that does get a little bit into the coyote issue, and it's just how wolves shape rivers. You know, it's a 4-minute YouTube thing. I think they've actually done a pretty good job in reconstructing the story of what did happen. So it's not only large carnivores that are in decline. Again, this is a quote I've taken from an article about saving the world's terrestrial megafauna. Because we know we are in a biodiversity crisis. But without a prey base, there's no carnivores. That's pretty much certain. So I like to consider wolves as nature's litmus test. If you've read this sign, I repeated it because I like it so much. And again, this comes from Paul Paquette. So I really see the wolf almost as a challenge to humans, and almost as that medicine wolf that's been talked about. If we can learn to live and coexist with the wolf, well, then we've probably got a decent relationship with nature and the environment that can sustain us. So some different ways to get involved. I already mentioned contact your MLA, definitely. We've got some petitions over there, not only asking for an end to the wolf cull, but to start protecting critical caribou habitat now. Let's have a moratorium on logging in those areas. That petition is also available on our website if you'd like to download it, or if you'd like to take copies, fill them up, and mail them back to us, there is an address at the bottom. This is a print petition because it will be used in legislature. Support organizations working on this. This cute guy here with this cute dog, that's a social media campaign we've got. And I say, stop the wolf cull for the love of dog. Genetically, they're identical. A taxonomist will tell you you have a wolf in your living room. It's about 0.2% mitochondrial DNA difference between these species. Now, behaviorally, yes, they are very, very different. We don't want wolves sitting on our front porch like they're a dog, definitely not. But again, we go to great extremes to treat our dogs well. We don't allow puppy mills. We don't even let our dogs be in hot cars. And we shouldn't. That's great. But what about their ancestors? All of the things that we love about our pets have been inherited from wolves. Playfulness, companionship, loyalty, hunting skills, guard animals, those are all wolf traits. Participate in our survey. So everybody has a card on their seat, which is the survey. I've mentioned that. Please take a moment. Again, whatever side you're on, I'd like to hear what people are thinking. Volunteer your time to spread this message and support organizations that are working on this. So it certainly is time. Science is not going to change things. It's people pushing the relevant science that is going to have an effect. So definitely support people who are using data, not dogma. Let's use scientific evidence. Now keep in mind, science doesn't give us permission to cause harm, but it is an important tool to inform us. So Canada, you know, I haven't looked this up in a couple of years, so I really do need to look it up. But I learned about 5 years ago that Canada is home to 1/5 of the world's remaining wilderness. And we've protected less than 10% of our habitat, terrestrial. It was less than 1% of our ocean. I know there are some people working very hard on that, so hopefully these numbers are going up. But the bottom line is we need to preserve biodiversity. Biodiversity breeds resiliency. We don't know what genes we're going to need in the future. So let's protect everything that we can, and that starts with protecting their habitat. And that's pretty much it for my presentation. I know that is a lot of information that I've tried to relay over a short time. I could talk for a lot longer on this, but I also know the reality of attention spans. So thank you for staying with me and for giving me your attention. And I certainly would like to open the floor up to any questions that people might have.